want to talk about Davey Johnson and the passing of Davey Johnson. Passed away at 82 years old, 13-year playing career, played for Baltimore, won 2 world championships with them, Atlanta, Philadelphia, and Chicago Cubs as well. A 4-time All-Star, 3-time Gold Glover, 2-time world champion, as I mentioned, in 1966 with Baltimore, and as well as 1970. Managed the Mets for 7 seasons, 1984 to 1990. His record, 595 and 417, winningest manager in franchise history. Finished no lower than second place in his tenure as Mets manager. Had the Mets either first, second, had 1 losing record, and it was the year that he was fired in 1990, where the team started off 20-22 before they, axed him for Bud Harrelson. Won the 1986 World Championship with the New York Mets, and he went into the Hall of Fame in 2010, along with Frank Cashin, Doc Gooden, and Darryl Strawberry into the Mets Hall of Fame. Maybe even just if it's for as manager, you think that Davey Johnson should be in the Hall of Fame, I would think.
I would certainly not object to it, and perhaps it's because he only had the 1 world championship that he has thus far been overlooked. He certainly has enough credentials, but in our world, like you said, he is a Hall of Famer, and it should be recalled that in 2012, when the Mets unveiled their all-time 50th anniversary team, it was Davey Johnson who was named the all-time manager. His number is not retired. His number is retired, but it's not for him. We know that. And he does not have an entrance dedicated to him like Gil Hodges does. But he did a lot of the same things that Gil Hodges is revered for, perhaps in a different way with a different personality. But he was exactly the personality this franchise needed when they hired him in the fall of 1983. I think back to the footage of his introductory press conference, which was at the World Series in Philadelphia that fall. And it is often remembered that he came off, like a real gunslinger, saying, "I don't know why it took Frank so long to hire me," but I just remembered the fact that it was at the World Series, as if, the Mets were not a World Series team that year. It was just happened to be where the media were, but it was almost like Davey Johnson was saying, like, "Don't worry, like I'm going to be back with my team very soon." And sure enough, the World Series in 1986 was in New York at Shea Stadium. Just the right guy at the right time with the right attitude, the right amount of confidence, the right insights into the minor league personnel that he managed to the top of their respective leagues the few years he was doing that, before he reunites with Cashin, which is interesting because he and Cashin really, creative tension might be the kindest way to put their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I think by 1990 at 20 and 22, which is not much of a sample size, I think Cashin was just looking for the final excuse to rid himself of Davey Johnson. But, again, success in Baltimore as a player, the Atlanta setting the all-time second base home run record, which stood for a long time. And then he goes to Japan, by the way. He bats behind Sadahara O shortly after batting behind Henry Aaron. There's something of a not just a charmed life in his case, but a guy who could kind of do a little bit of everything in a baseball life, off the baseball grid. The first analytics manager before anybody used the word analytics, the first guy to use a computer and at least make a big deal out of it. Because, again, 1984, you're first introducing the Apple II, I think it was. This famous Super Bowl commercial, people are like, what the hell is that? Davey Johnson, very comfortable bringing that aspect into managing, but at the same time, never losing the human touch. There's a game in 1984 that springs to mind where it's a back and forth affair with the Phillies, and Rusty Staub has a terrible record against a reliever named Bill Campbell for the Phillies. And he brings up Rusty Staub to pinch hit, and he drives in the game-winning runs. And he's asked afterwards, "Why'd you bring in Rusty Staub there?" He said, "I had a hunch." It's just the sort of thing that Davey would do in his whole, especially 86, kind of culminated in that, where he said, "You know what do we have that's good here? We have really good hitters other than Hernandez and Carter, we don't necessarily have great defense. I'm going to emphasize the hitting. I'm going to play Howard Johnson at shortstop. I'm going to play Kevin Mitchell at shortstop. I'm going to figure out a way to get Mookie Wilson, who's been my center fielder, and Lenny Dykstra, who's my other center fielder, into the lineup every day, along with Kevin Mitchell. In some way, two of those three guys are going to be in there when it wasn't an obvious thing to do to move Mookie Wilson to left half the time. So he would not, get stuck in a rut. He would not be dictated to by the numbers, but he wasn't just, I'm going to manage by my gut. It was just a master class for years, I felt. And the one thing I come away from his 7 years as Met manager is that for 7 years, I never thought to myself, I got to get rid of this guy. How you just go through that in your mind when things start to go wrong, even if it's a manager who's had some success. Davey, I could have kept seeing as my manager for the rest of 1990, for the rest of the 1990s. It wasn't to be. And let's not forget the success he had with other organizations as a manager, leading Baltimore to the playoffs, leading Cincinnati to the playoffs, Washington to the playoffs. Didn't get the Dodgers there, but he got the Dodgers, stayed well above 500 with them. So, always a winner. We love to use that word in sports, always a winner. And he just had that sense to him. And I'll just close with my one interaction with him in my life, other than standing and applauding for him when that was the appropriate response. I got to, I wouldn't even call it an interview, just a couple of questions once. And I asked, they're probably going to retire number 5 here, but for David Wright, and they put up numbers for other managers here. How do you feel about that? You had a lot of success. You're like, I don't live in the past. That was like the essence of his answer. He was perfectly affable about it. But I definitely got the sense, and it wasn't really out of the ordinary than anything else I'd ever heard him say, that he was just a guy always ready for the next challenge and ready to put his mind to work at whatever it was. And hopefully, you in the crowd, you watching at home, you got to enjoy that. And God knows, from 1984 until 1990, especially in 1986, boy, did we get to enjoy what Davey Johnson did. So very sorry to know he's no longer with us, that we no longer have a living manager of a Met World Champion. I hope we will in the near future. It just goes to show you how hard it is, Anthony. Gil Hodges did it. Davey Johnson did it. And we're still waiting. Had some good managers, had some great teams. Still waiting for the next guy in the next team.
You mentioned he was way ahead of his time when it came to the analytics. I think Bobby Valentine even mentioned it in his biography when he was coaching on Davey Johnson's staff, about him and the computer and being all up in the analytics, but not letting it be too much. With the way managers come and go these days, after every couple of years, you changing it. Like Buck Showalter gets changed. People want to change Carlos Mendoza now because the team's struggling a little bit. How important was it to have Davey Johnson, not only have that length, but to come up through the minor leagues with a lot of the players that would end up being a part of that 86 championship team and that, 80s run in its entirety?
It certainly gave them a running start in 1984. He knew not only, the most famous example is Doc, seeing Doc as an 18-year-old blowing batters away and saying, I want him on my team next year. But even a guy like Wally Backman, who had a run in New York in the very early 80s and apparently had not impressed. I always wondered why not, because he could hit the ball. You could see that immediately. Even in my adolescence, I understood that. But he winds up back in Tidewater in 1983. A guy like who didn't last to 86, Ron Gardenhire, another one who they just sort of pushed aside. He said, I want these guys on my team next year. They know how to play baseball. They know how to win. Guy like Kevin Mitchell, who, again, if you can picture Kevin Mitchell in your mind, he doesn't seem all that athletic, but Davey Johnson saw something in him. He saw that it was worth harnessing what Lenny Dykstra could bring you. And he was comfortable with the veteran players. He was comfortable with a guy like Keith Hernandez, who he played against, a guy like Gary Carter when he came in, that he could relate to. It was good to have somebody who just sort of understood his personnel, whether he shepherded them along the way, which isn't always something that works. Generation before that, there was a Met manager named Joe Frazier who they brought up from Tidewater with the idea that, well, he knows the personnel. It didn't matter. It wasn't great personnel, and he wasn't a great manager. Uh, Davey Johnson, just again, it was just the right blend of personalities as well as talent, because he trusted those guys, and they knew it. Again, it's a different game today where you probably have to communicate a lot more and that's what you always hear about Mendoza. You heard it about Showalter. You heard it about Terry Collins when things were going well, that he was always talking to his players. I saw a quote in the last few days from Tim Tuffle, not necessarily a quote from this weekend, but from whatever it was during Johnson's tenure. Davey communicates through his lineup card. In other words, you're playing or you're not playing. But players also kind of knew their roles. We always talk about Gil Hodges as being the great platoonist manager, sharing a lot of positions. Davey did that too. Tuffle and Backman, like I said, Mookstra, if you will, getting Mitchell in there, being able to work Danny Heap in there when George Foster was faltering. And of course, Knight and Hojo, when you leaned on one and didn't lean on the other, when you leaned on the both and you found spots for both of them. So and by the way, I'll just throw this in. It was a 24-man roster in those years, 86 to 89. So you were dealing with a longer bench than you have today because you didn't have as many pitchers, but you still had fewer options. There were times he used Rick Aguilera, pitcher, as a pinch hitter. And it wasn't just to be cute. It's like, well, this game is getting on. I need to use my best hitting pitcher. So, he was in the game.
And he did bring up Doc a little early, knew he was ready, and in '84, and that ended up being one of the best moves and biggest moves to jumpstart his tenure as the manager. In his 2018 book, My Wild Ride in Baseball and Beyond, Davey Johnson said about his style of managing the Mets that I just let everybody do their thing. Now, that was a good thing with this team, but also kind of a detriment to, the guys like Darryl Strawberry as well as Doc Gooden, who went through their personal issues and weren't able to, stick and click with the Mets for what should have been their entire careers.
Yeah, I don't know how it works, how your, shall we say, your supervisor at work would keep you from your demons necessarily. Perhaps he should have seen more. Perhaps somebody else in the organization should have, reached a hand out and said, what are you doing there? I think his job was to manage a baseball team to wins on the field. And you would hope that he would do right by all his players. So I don't really put responsibility for what happened with Gooden and Strawberry off the field on Davey Johnson. It may have been a collective organizational failure to not recognize what was going on. But, to this day, we hear from both Strawberry and Gooden about how much they appreciated Davey as a manager and as a human being. So I would, again, with the caveat that, you can't walk a mile in somebody else's shoes.
Yeah.
It seemed to work out for the best where it needed to work out for the best as a baseball team. And the fact that, there are people who I suppose could have just kept to themselves this weekend who did nothing but sing the praises of Davey Johnson from their experiences being managed by him. So all around, and definitely, again, Doc Gooden, 19 years old, is not an obvious call up or promotion at the outset of the 1984 season. It changes the complexion of the pitching staff completely. It changes the outlook for that team completely. And that team is no longer that, oh my God, we're going to finish last. And if we're lucky, we'll finish next to last team that we went through for
No, they won 90 games.
Yeah. And nobody expected it. Maybe Johnson expected it, I think. The rest of us were just thinking, well, maybe we'll be a little better this year. That team's in first place at the end of July. And it just sort of ran out of experience, let's say, against the Cubs. But, it was on its way. And, would have been nice to have won a few more later on in 87 or 88 and clear to when he had to leave in 1990. There are other teams on the field too, and sometimes it doesn't work out. But again, that was a golden era. and right at the head of right at the head of making it golden was Davey Johnson.
Last thing on Davey Johnson, and Maureen mentioned it in the chat as well. Davey and Bud Harrelson have that distinction of being a part of both Mets World Series teams. Obviously, Harrelson was on both World Championship teams, but Davey made the final out of the 1969 World Series. That catch by Cleon Jones, where he bends to the knee to make the final catch of the out. And, he wins the 1986 World Champion. I know 69 is the Miracle Mets, but, 86 was somewhat of a miracle itself, considering what was going on in Game 6.
Yeah, 86 decided it was just too easy being a dominant Mets team. It's not characteristic. Let's make this miraculous. Hey, let's throw Tom Seaver in there as well. Tom Seaver is on the bench for the Boston Red Sox and not pitching instead of Al Nipper. And who knows what happens then. But yeah, Davey would be a part of Met history, whether he had ever managed a day for the Mets or not, because he would be Marty Barrett and Davey Johnson would be a trivia answer. As it happens, it is just kind of trivial that he was the Oriole that made that last out. Those Oriole teams were so good. You mentioned 2 world championships, 4 pennants. When they inaugurated division play, they won practically every year in the first bunch of years that there was an American League East. And Davey was a big part of that, along with Frank Robinson, Brooks Robinson, Jim Palmer, all those guys. So it just goes to show you that he was, for somebody who never struck me as a quote unquote baseball lifer, a guy who kind of hangs around the game or just decides that this is all I can do. This is a guy who had an incredible baseball life, and because of it, I think we had an incredible baseball life, certainly when he was here and whenever we reflect upon it.